Hello, and welcome to another episode of Great Women in Compliance, hosted by the Compliance Podcast Network and sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights. I am Hemma Lomax, and I'm here with my guest co host and quick sponsor, Sarah Haddon. And we have a power packed roundtable for you today with Roxanne Petraeus and Susan Frank Divers. Roxanne is the CEO and co founder of Athena, a US Army veteran and a McKinsey alum. And she's also a super mum of two adorable little boys and much, much more. And Susan has served as the CECO at ACOM, the Executive Director of Ethics' Business Ethics Leadership Alliance, Bella, our Director of Thought Leadership at LRN, and she now works as an advisor to Athena with Roxanne. So we are so delighted to have you both here. Thank you for joining us today, Roxanne and Susan.
Thank you for having us. Pleasure.
And I'm so happy to be here today as well. Hemma, you started off by saying that we had a power-packed episode in front of us, and we certainly do with these two guests. And I have to be honest, whenever I get a chance to talk to female entrepreneurs, I get really excited because that's a world that I myself am in. And I cannot wait to hear more about the company and what you're doing and the origin story behind it and how you two are working together to do such important things in this space. And I want to just kick it off about talking about the past somewhat, how you arrived at this spot, particularly how did you know that compliance and ethics was going to be your career path? How did you end up on that? And maybe how you knew that it was the right path for you. Roxanne, can we start with you?
Sure. So yeah, my path to compliance and ethics is nonlinear, so I would describe it. And so my background is actually I was in the Army for almost 8 years, served as an active duty officer. And I don't have a background in HR. I don't have a background. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a compliance professional. I was just like a regular officer in the Army. But my experience there actually had a lot to do with ethics and compliance. I just didn't recognize it in those terms. So, for example, I was a woman in the Army, and the Army is heavily male dominated. And I would sit through these trainings on sexual harassment prevention and think, I wish I just had an hour back of my time because that was so unproductive that it was actually counterproductive. It made the issues a joke. And it definitely didn't help anyone navigate a tricky situation. I was in the Army during a lot of the ethics issues that made the front page of the New York Times. There were issues with like war crimes and like just sorts of all sorts of like really challenging ethical situations and dilemmas. And I went through training on them. And I think a lot of the training was in that space, like very good and very powerful, helped me remember different phrases or what right looks like and really instilled the concept of ethics. And so I just had all that swimming around in my brain. And then I left my time in service, went to McKinsey, and ironically had a somewhat similar experience. It was around the time where a lot of the opioid epidemic stuff was coming to light. And I remember looking on the front page of the New York Times and seeing this like pretty scathing critique of McKinsey's involvement in it, literally the same day that I had received some risk training at McKinsey. And I was like clicking next, just thinking, this training doesn't really help me. It's very high level, do the right thing, be ethical. And clearly it is addressing a problem because I'm reading about a problem in the New York Times, but this training doesn't help me at all to know what to do, who to report to if I see something, like all of it. And that was the immediate spark for this idea of what if you actually approach the space from the perspective of how would you design training and eventually reporting systems if you intended them to actually work versus just check a box. I was a little bit naive, didn't really understand why companies even did this. But yeah, that is my kind of winding path to the ethics and compliance space.
Wow. I have to ask, was there like a particular moment, particularly in service when you were in the Army, that you realized, I'm going to fight this battle? I can make a difference here. This is going to be about what I can do.
Yeah, I think
Did it
that,
become personal, I think is what I'm saying.
oh, it was hyper personal all the time
Mhm.
because it was in the Army. I think unlike another job, you don't really go home at the end of the day. Right? Like I wasn't deployed the entire time for sure, but it's a very all encompassing job. And I was a woman in the Army the entire time. And so a lot of these issues I just saw firsthand. But yeah, I think it did. I can remember like specific situations where a soldier might come to me in more of a personal moment and be like, man, a question like, what's it like to be a woman in the Army? Or like, why are we not allowed to say this word or this phrase anymore? And it struck me as, oh, someone like really wants to do the right thing, but they are unsure. They need it to be put in terms that kind of make sense for them. versus this kind of like highfalutin language. I think a lot about this concept of Pentagon posters versus what you saw in your day to day. So, like, Pentagon posters are the equivalent in the ethics and compliance space of just putting out a phrase, do the right thing, and then thinking that an entire company has got it. In particular, I think something that struck me is noticing how much control a local commander has over your life. So, every commander would be like, I have an open door policy. They all said it. They knew they were supposed to say it. But it was very clear the ones who I was like, no, you do not, because through the grapevine that is so strong and powerful, I know of 5 different things that were brought to your attention. And you told those people when there was ethics issues, when there was HR issues, you told those people to not bring you that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so even just like seeing the difference that a commander swapping out would make. The same soldiers one day were like saying and doing the right thing. And then a commander comes in and subtly and not so subtly indicates that he's like A-okay with a wide variety of behavior. And you just saw soldiers tweak their behavior, myself included. Like, we're all actually a bit susceptible to what the boss thinks. So those are like a couple of different sort of freeze frames that I have in my mind.
Yeah. So you saw up close and personal processes that weren't working, and yet you also saw people that seemed to want to be educated. They wanted the
Totally.
knowledge and the training. That's a really hopeful message, actually.
Very much like I think sometimes it can sound very negative. Like, I actually got really inspired by a lot of the soldiers and officers who were there to do the right thing. But I think sometimes the system, through either like it was designed that way or just like bureaucratic inertia, got to places where it was like actively almost like working against the individuals. Okay. Remember there was this concept, I'm sure it still exists, of an inspector general, and there was like a box somewhere on post where you could put them into a box. And no one I think ever explicitly told me this, but I definitely got the impression that you go to that box at your own peril. If you are a soldier who's like putting a concern into that box, like you are a troublemaker, you maybe are like on your way out and you're disgruntled. And I would have never thought in a million years to report any of the like myriad of issues that I either saw or personally experienced. I was not going to walk over to that box, basically like risk my career. And I think it's really unfortunate because I know, that there were very much senior leaders who did care and wanted people to speak up and do the right thing. But yeah, I think just sometimes organizations can end up with these systems that are very like fax machine fossil like and are not at all serving what I think is the intent, which is, yeah, the vast majority of people I served with were of high integrity and wanted the organization to do right.
What a great example of a process not working and how much that must mirror what goes on in so many workplaces. Susan, I know that your path is probably quite different from Roxanne's, and yet you've ended up at the same place. Tell our listeners, if you would, about your own.
Sure. And as you've pointed out, it has a happy ending. So I started out right out of college. I took the foreign service test and passed, and then thought about it and decided to go to night law school at the same time. And the State Department actually assigned me to the first Foreign Corrupt Practices Act treaty initiative, which was a really long time ago. And I think it took, in the end, over 20 years to conclude it. But I found myself going to the UN regularly for meetings as part of the delegation and learning about international corruption. And that's just an area that I've been in ever since, really. And that's probably where it all started. But I then went and I was going to get an LLM from LSE in London, but I wound up working for a British firm and they encouraged me to qualify. So I qualified as an English lawyer. Overqualification is one of the things I do well. And when I came back, I joined what was then Bob Strauss's law firm. And they said, oh, you know something about bribery. You're it. And cutting to the quick, I eventually went in-house with SAIC, which was a big science and tech company and still is, although it's now in 2 pieces. And I started their ethics and compliance program before it was called that. In fact, we didn't even have online training. We ran around and did the training ourselves whenever we could. But I got very deeply into that area. And by the time I left SAIC after 13 years, I was hired by AECOM to really revamp and start afresh with their ethics and compliance program. By that time, there was online training, which was helpful. And so I worked there for 6 years, and we were lucky because that program had tremendous support in the company, the audit department, communications team. and we won a slew of awards, which was really helpful for our brand because it became a positive in the company, not a negative. And then after that, I tried to retire and flunked. And and my husband was like, my late husband said, "Are you really going to reorganize the spice store again?" So that was a clue. And I joined LRN for 7 years and became the head of thought leadership and best practices and headed all of LRN's research, which was really fascinating. And then decided it was time for a change. And Tim Erblich at Ethisphere introduced Roxanne and myself, and it's great. Here we are.
So starting a training program in a vacuum where one had never existed before, then leading training, and now helping to design it and to create the messaging about it to the marketplace. Am I following correctly?
Yeah, I can't escape from it.
No, I guess not. And all of that underpinned by important work with the FCPA and anti-corruption in its early days.
Yep, that's what
There's
started.
there's a lot that can be learned from those early days, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
So what's next on the horizon with the two of you? You've teamed up relatively recently. That's correct?
Last couple of months, I think. But I feel like post COVID, the world is a blur. So I would believe that it's been like 4 years. But yes, I think, is that right? 4 or 5 months?
Yeah, it has, Roxanne.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So the energy that you two are bringing into this space, I'm sure you're also sharing with your team. Tell me a little bit about how you're operating together and how you're operating in the context of the larger team.
Totally. I'm happy to go first and then Susan fill in anything I missed. So my co-founder and I were incredibly excited when we got introduced to Susan because I mentioned my long winding, way to compliance that does not flow through maybe traditional compliance spaces. I think that's been a huge advantage in that we've been able to approach problems from a very fresh perspective and kind of ask, like, how would you design a system if you didn't know anything and designed it from first principles? But what's been really fabulous in getting Susan's perspective is she has just like such a depth of knowledge of what companies have tried to do before, what's worked, what hasn't. I think one of the most common refrains I hear from our customers is they're really looking to hear what other compliance departments are doing, not because it's like cheating or anything, but because it can be a really like siloed, lonely role. I think you may be the sole compliance person at an organization and you're really wanting to make sure that you're bringing best practices to the org, but there might not be as many conferences or sort of professional forums where you're sharing these best practices. And so I have really loved getting Susan's perspective, both internally, which we can talk to in terms of things like, hey, what should our hotline product look like? What should the case management do? What types of scenarios should be in our code of conduct training? That's all magical. But what's really cool is also being able to bring Susan's perspective to our customers, to our prospective customers, and just talk with a lot of learned expertise about what good looks like, about the trade-offs. If you do training in-house, here's the benefits. But if you use a vendor, here's the benefit. I think in my opinion, the best like sales and marketing is not aggressive sales and marketing. It's just like getting curious about the problem and being really passionate about the space in general, and whether or not you go with Athena, I totally understand. But I just want to hear and bring really valuable like thought leadership to our customers.
Yeah. And from my perspective, one of the many pleasures of joining Athena, aside from the fact that it's woman-owned, woman entrepreneur, and has all this intellectual energy, is how smart they've been and how much Roxanne and Anne have invested in the right areas for the platform to make it easy to use and to incorporate features that, frankly, in bigger companies in the learning space have been a real struggle. They just went out and did it. And that nimbleness really comes out when we talk to clients. Athena is about making it easy for clients to put in place good training. And it's about engaging training. It's not the Soviet style 45-minute lecture on how to fix a truck that makes you want to throw your computer out the window. It's really meeting people where they are. And that's really refreshing. And as I mentioned, the energy and the insight and the amount of knowledge that you've acquired already, Roxanne, you and Anne, is really phenomenal. So it's a great place for me to be at this point.
I love that for you both. That's wonderful that you bring your energies together. And look, Rox, I know that one thing that's very deeply helpful for you is the listening piece. Like you live that, and you do listen to your customers. And so I would love to hear from you and Susan, what you've seen as the most pressing issues of the day for your customers, and what do they keep coming back to you for? What is it that what unmet need are you finding that you can meet for them?
I'm happy to give first thing, which is I feel like the word of the year has been overtraining. Our customers are just and prospects, folks in the space, they just hear over and over, look, there's just things have to be short, punchy, effective. And if leadership feels like we're overtraining, if employees feel like we're overtraining, if heaven forbid the CTO or CRO feel like we're overtraining, like it's going to be really challenging. And I super resonate with that problem statement. Going back to like time in the army or even McKinsey, I was the eye roll employee. You tell me to do something and I'd be like, and I think that the thing that would really like frustrate employees like me is if you give me something that's not relevant to my role or just doesn't feel relevant at all. So if I am a soldier, like trying to deploy and you give me some training that's like about a totally different country than the one I'm going to, I'm like, why did you waste my time? That's not at all relevant. And so one of that problem statement, we're working with customers on things like, okay, how do we make it really easy to do role-based training? How do we make it really easy to do refresher training, right? Maybe the first year that an employee joins, you want to do your full code of conduct. But maybe after that, you just want to refresh them. Hey, we've had a couple of issues last year in related to data privacy. And so I'm going to give you a short, and by short, 2 to 3 minute refresher on our policies, how these scenarios play out, and I'm going to test you on them. And I think sometimes make it shorter can sound really negative. Hey, this ethics and compliance stuff isn't important. Just knock it out and be done with it. But I actually think it can be incredibly powerful if you recognize that like time does not equal outcomes. In the army, we had this whenever you would want to be like snarky, you would ask, are we training to time? Or are we training to standard? Because like training to time meant I'm going to be here till 5 p.m. and it doesn't matter what I do. So I might as well just like drag my feet. Training to standard is like a way better way to do things, which is if I can figure this out and demonstrate mastery of the subject, I'm done. And so I think a long way of saying that we're really interested in building products that make it incredibly easy to be hyper targeted, which has the added benefit of making training shorter, more because you don't have to do this peanut butter approach of just spread a lot to everybody.
And you're so right about the time point. And I love what you say, the time or the standard, because
Yeah,
often we measure our training in the number of hours we've delivered and the number of hours we've
totally.
completed. And so there's an inherent friction there when our employees or our business partners are telling us, hey, we haven't got time for this, make it relevant. And we're telling ourselves, let's get these various risk areas covered in a certain
Yeah.
period of time. How have you been able to respond to the relevance piece? Because I think as we see an ever increasing risk landscape, I love that you say make it tailored to role and make it tailored to function, but the functions and the roles and the risks are ever increasing. So how have you been helping your customers with that?
Yeah, it's a really hard problem statement, and I really empathize with our customers. I think that what I've seen the best leaders do is recognize that they can't fight risk everywhere and just say, yeah, is it possible that this HR person is actually the tip of the spear for a big ABAC thing? Maybe, but probably not. And so I'm just going to feel confident in my assessment that this isn't the biggest risk assessment. This was actually the good lesson from the Army as well. I think sometimes we can kid ourselves into thinking that we can eliminate all risk, and that kind of actually can backfire because it means you aren't spending like your maximum amount of energy on the big thing that matters. And so you're like running around exhausting yourself. And I think there's just like very much an analogy to training, because if you think an employee is paying as much attention on hour 6 as they are in hour 1, like you have not spent any time with a junior employee. Like they have tuned out. They have figured out a way to tune out. So I think my job as the vendor is to give, like Susan used the word nimble, give them nimble tools, make it super easy so that they're not like, how could I possibly do risk-based training? I can barely do annual training for the whole company. And then it's unfortunately the compliance leader's job to have the confidence in their assessment of the risk at the company. And we can provide best practices, which is of course something Susan does really well.
Susan, please tell us about the best practice. I know you've won some awards for your training profiles.
So
I first want to pull out a theme that's inherent in everything Roxanne just said, which Athena, again, has gotten right from the start. And the research I headed at LRN over the last 5 years, we tracked a trend that showed that the shift had occurred in training away from just pushing content. And that's what you were just mentioning too, and training to time. And the focus had, even before the pandemic, started to shift towards how are the employees experiencing this and looking at from the employee's perspective. And I think that's driven a lot of the focus. Even DOJ guidance has a lot of this on what's your role? Do you need this training? We were working at LRN with a major drug store chain, and their new VP of human resources said she had been trained on hazardous waste disposal because that was part of the curriculum. And that's an example of maybe something she didn't really need to know. So the focus has really, among the best companies and the best providers, shifted to the employee experience and that nimbleness and the sort of ability to say, okay, we don't have to have 45 minutes on this. We can encapsulate the key messages, hopefully in ways that people can really understand and put our training in that form. I think Roxanne and Anne really got that right from the start. And that is what people are looking for because there is and there's irrelevant training and there's useless training. And it really doesn't benefit anybody if that's where the training program is.
I think the thing is, we all agree on that. I think even myself, as the head of a compliance function, don't want to take that training sometimes myself. So we've got to, when we agree on that as a baseline, then we get to ask what we can do about it. I think you've mentioned a couple of times the employee experience, which I love. I think that's such a perfect angle through which to evaluate this. And just to take that one step far beyond the eye roll and the feedback that it's too long, oftentimes these employees have some information to give us about what it should be and what would be relevant. And so I'd love to hear from you. How are you capturing that feedback and turning that back into useful information to co-create the content, frequency, what's relevant for the training?
Yeah, Hemma, you and I talked about this thing at Atmosphere, this idea of crowdsourcing risk, because I completely agree that like, employees are incredibly smart. They're the ones who face these problems all day. And I think the best compliance officers have found a bunch of different ways to get that info from employees, at least one-on-ones, office hours, things like that. But I think a couple of cool tools that we have and can and continue to iterate on. One is just a joke like make training like a restaurant on Yelp, let employees rate it, and they will tell you what is relevant and what is irrelevant. And we've done that since we rolled out our very first training years ago. We just let employees rate every 5 minutes of content. And then we surface to every customer their employees' ratings at an aggregate scale. We don't let them see an individual employee because we want employees to keep giving honest feedback. That is just incredibly powerful. We're partnering with Ethisphere to deliver their like ethical culture assessment to our customers. And I think that's very powerful because that's another set of data that can show you like, okay, what are my risk areas? Where am I under and overperforming? And then tailor training based on that. And then the last kind of tool that we have is a product that I think is just so exciting because I go back to that Inspector General's box somewhere on Post and think that was not how you get an employee to report. Is a hotline. And so we've done a lot of work to think about how do you make a hotline that looks like it's not a fax machine, that is really easy to access, that gives employees context, right? You might go to the hotline, but you're not ready to report yet. And you might want to see some FAQs. Where's my report going to go to? I certainly don't want to go ask somebody that, right? Like, how embarrassing is that? Like, hey, Chief Compliance Officer, for no reason in particular, I'm curious if I report something, who's it going to go to? Absolutely not. And so all of these tools, survey, training feedback, and hotline, I think just allow customers to have this like comprehensive area to see a bunch of information versus having it be all scattershot. Yeah, some of it lives in Excel and some of it lives in someone's brain, but they left 2 years ago. So that's something I think a lot about.
So important to have those various listening channels. And then
Totally.
what comes to mind for me as you're describing that, Roxanne, is that's how we're going to get continuous improvement. It's not a one and done. You can't ask a question, answer it, and you're set for decades. You're going to have to keep getting that information in.
Yes.
We hear so much about the importance of a speak up culture. That's just like a phrase I hear all the time. Is a listen up culture different? Are we putting a finer point on it when we say it's important to have a listening culture?
Roxanne, do you want me to start on this?
Please.
Yeah, and that's an area that I'm really passionate about, Sarah, because when I first got really involved in setting up compliance programs, the focus was strictly on speak up, and the campaign was always speak up. But if you speak up, and as Roxanne says, you've just thrown your career away, in the example from the Army, or a company investigates and fires you, such as what happened with Wells Fargo employees, the Valley Dam that collapsed, I could go on, then you've actually done more harm than good. So to me, you can't urge people to speak up unless you're really serious about listening up. And unless you're very clear on your value of fairness and transparency in how you investigate that. And I've done some research in the past with other people in this area, behavioral scientists, and we've all concluded that one of the quickest ways to completely gut any ethics and compliance program is to have people speak up and then either not listen to them or fire them. The other way is to have two different standards of justice for one set of employees and then the high performers or the executives. But so to me, it's an absolutely critical point.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I guess I'd just add that I don't think as a company you get to say you have a speak up culture. I think unfortunately your employees determine whether you have a speak
Mhm.
up culture. And I think like, I've definitely seen whether it's in the army or in the private sector, leaders kid themselves into thinking that they get to say they have a speak up culture, right? Because it's you know what you think. You need to hear what everybody else thinks. And that comfort is really just determined by employees. And what determines that is exactly what Susan said, which is what do they see happen? If I see the first person to raise their hand get shot down, like I'm good. Like I'll sit on my feedback and keep it to myself. And if I see that person is treated with respect and dignity and it was taken seriously, I'm just like far more likely to share my own perspective. I think as leaders, which is of course even important for, or especially important for chief compliance officers, I've always thought about advice I've been given, which is like the higher up you get, the less people are willing to tell you the truth because it's very risky for them, right? Like,
Mm.
and I think the same it holds for organizations. And yeah, I just think a lot about that. Like the employees are the ones who really determine whether or not there's a speak up culture.
That's so
And you
powerful, Roxanne. Sorry. So I just wanted to comment on that because I think I love what you said. You don't get to determine whether you have it, your employees do. It reminds me of when we have the zero tolerance policy for retaliation. Again, we get to write it, but we don't get to determine whether that's happening. We have to be
No.
really intentional about the structures and frameworks and the transparency, quite frankly, that we're bringing. And I think one of the things that I'm getting from the theme from the two of you is integrated risk management, this getting the listening channels into one place so you can see what's happening and then build structures around that. And then hopefully
Totally.
report out to say, look, this percent of you had an issue with this in various channels. This is what we did about it. These are the number of times people spoke up and something was done. Even if you keep the confidentiality, you really can make a difference with transparency. So I didn't want to interrupt, but I was just so
no, no, no.
thrilled with that statement by Roxanne about not thinking we get to decide, but showing and being intentional about it, really operationalizing those intentions.
Absolutely. And then measuring later so that up and down the chain, everybody knows what kinds of results you are achieving. Talk to me a little bit, if you would, Roxanne, about the importance of measuring. What are the metrics that matter when you're talking to your client companies about how to draw conclusions? What's your conversation about measurement?
Yeah. One that's very important. I remember we were showing Susan like our product, we showed her our analytics, and she's wow, because we have this like very responsive dashboard. But I will say, I say like garbage in, garbage out. I guess I wouldn't want to fool anyone into thinking like just because you have a sleek dashboard, therefore you have like operational truth, right? Like I've seen many commanders, for example, have a dashboard full of green. And you know, then at the organization, things are not green, but nobody was comfortable in saying the green. But yeah, I think that the ability to have a really comprehensive report and not have completion be the only thing that is reported on, right? Like, that should be the baseline, in no way the ceiling, right? So yeah, you should have a system that makes it very easy to track. Yes, you have 99% completion. Great. But I think some of the areas that I see a lot of our customers be really sophisticated in are everything from employee sentiment to things like how are they answering the questions. I was talking with a customer who said, turns out he realized there was a lot of confusion based on how employees were answering scenarios on side letters and contracts within the sales team. And he wouldn't have known that if he hadn't been able to see that, employees got this scenario. So you give some context and you say A, B, C, or D, which is right. And when you have questions that aren't so obvious, but instead are actually a little bit complicated, those can often surface like, oh, employees do not understand our policy. They might not even know our policy. Remember one of our customers early on asked a question around, do you know we have a dating policy? I was like, turns out people did not know they have a dating policy. So that means they definitely did not know what is in that dating policy. So these are all like knowledge-based questions. And then the last area that gets really sophisticated is when you can couple not just the hotline data. I think Erica from Ethisphere talks so eloquently about the idea that Hotline data is very important, but it's also incredibly incomplete because it's only representing, she uses this like 136, which I think comes from Ethisphere's reports, meaning for every one report issued to a hotline, 3 are brought to like HR, to compliance, but 6 are brought to the frontline managers. And so if you don't have a system, like a really easy to use case management system, those managers might not know that they actually got some sort of report, right? They might have thought it's just, hey, Susan, do you have 15 minutes? I just want to talk to you about something. And if that manager doesn't realize, oh, a flag should be going up, like what that employee shared might be like really important, that information goes nowhere. And so then as a senior compliance leader, a senior legal leader, you don't get like what is the vast majority of reports that are happening at your company because they are not actually getting it to be in your purview. So I think a lot about a really good dashboard, but then also making sure that there is still that human element because a lot of these early warning signals don't necessarily exist in like the most formal channel like the hotline. They're much more in these, do you have 15 minutes type of conversations.
It's far more nuanced, isn't it?
Totally.
Susan.
Yeah. And I would just add to what Roxanne said that I think there's a lot of, I'll call it mythologizing out in the marketplace right now that any company has to have a big, elaborate analytics platform. There are certainly vendors out there with them. And it's a scary thing. Do you have a big analytics platform? Does it do everything from stand on its head to whistle? And I just had a conversation with Lisa Smith, who is the Deputy General Counsel in the fraud section at Justice. I asked her that question and she said, no. She said, have what makes sense for you, have what makes sense for your company. And you don't have to have what when Matt Galvin was there, just design analytics that give you meaningful data like Roxanne was just discussing. And I think that's refreshing to hear because I think there's just a lot of misconception out there at the moment. It's become a scary thing like AI is becoming too. So
I was going to add that, that now that we're past the idea of, oh, you got to have a whiz bang technology platform. Well, AI being the next thing that is liable to distract companies from what is truly important, what's really driving result.
And on that point, in terms of what's truly important, the other thing that keeps me up at night is what should I be reporting on when it comes to these things, the culture survey, the hotline data, the training. And we've poo-pooed a little bit the idea of completion data and hotline numbers on their own don't really tell the story. So how can you help us tell that story now? What should we be wanting to tell our boards, our C-suite when it comes to the effectiveness of the compliance function?
Do you want to take this first?
yeah, that's a really good question, Hemma. And I'll use my favorite overused analogy, which is if you're only reporting completion data, it's like throwing seeds over your neighbor's yard and then hoping they grow and all that. You don't really know what kind of impact you're having. So the best programs I've seen in this area really focus on the type of data that Roxanne was describing, where it's employee sentiment and what are the employees saying. And as she pointed out, that's in conversations because you may see something that troubles you, but you're certainly not going to run off and file a hotline report about it. But being able to talk it out with your manager in an atmosphere of trust. So I see companies really trying to capture that data. And the same if you're consolidating HR data. Other companies I've seen have also consolidated IT incidents because that may not be traditionally part of HR or compliance. But if you're not doing well in terms of that area, then that's a clue. The short answer is as much data as you can. And I think you mentioned it like a bottoms up risk review. The more you can do that and actually get input from people at all levels of the company, the more accurate picture you're going to have of what are the issues in your compliance program and where is it succeeding and where is it not. And boards, I think, have finally come around to realize that as well.
I love that very humble attitude to sentiment and to the employee's experience that's been a theme of what you've both said. For me, it's almost redefining the culture, or at least the assessment of culture. So we know that culture is an important piece of this, but now as I hear you talk, I'm starting to think about taking the pulse of the culture from the employees in various ways, and sentiment being one of them, participation another, maybe looking at other risk areas and how they're behaving there, because that gives you some clues. I think that's wonderful. And Sarah, you mentioned AI. As you mentioned that, I thought, gosh, a lot of the software now is looking at sentiment, human sentiment analysis. So exciting times for us. If we know what to focus on and we know what to measure, there are tools at our disposal. Rox, I did want to not let you speak on that point as well.
Oh, no worries. I'll just add, I saw one of our customers that I was working on their board presentation, and exactly what Susan said. I thought it was so smart because they were really focused on a couple of different areas. So I can't remember the specifics, but let's say they really cared about like, are employees aware of our code of conduct and maybe one or two policies within it? And what they were doing is using Athena's data to report on sort of employee sentiment, like awareness the year before, and then employees awareness after training. And I thought that was so intelligent. So I think in this particular example, it was something like 45% of our employees were aware of this particular policy. And I thought that was really clever because they were saying, yeah, we did have an awareness gap and we reported on it and we were honest about it. And then here's what we did with the training. It was very targeted to a couple of different population groups. And then we went back and asked them, are you aware of this policy now? And they were able to show growth, which I think to the point of like completion, okay, the employee sat there, but growth, you're able to say, no, we actually moved the needle on this particular topic. A question we ask a lot, and our employees put a lot into our surveys embedded into harassment prevention training is, are you willing to report an incident on behalf of a colleague? Are you confident reporting? Things like that. And showing the change in employee sentiment year over year, I think can be a really powerful way to get beyond just completion and really get at what you're really trying to measure, which is more of this culture piece.
I love that. So sentiment beyond the eye roll. It's very exciting.
That's right.
Beyond the eye roll. I love it.
The
Yeah.
eye roll was so last season. And look, I've been in rooms.
Yeah.
The regulators will ask you, what are you learning from your training? They're not asking you
Right.
what your employees are learning from the training. They're asking you what you're learning from the training. So I love that gap analysis piece that you're talking about, that we should be curious about the gaps so that we can then fill them. And again, back to what gets measured gets done. If you measure the gaps, you find the gaps. If you find the gaps, you can then fill them. Very powerful. So what do you think about all this with this training 2.0 or 4.0, wherever we are?
Actually, I want to just throw out a question that's a non sequitur, if I can. I was looking at your website earlier, fabulous website, by the way, and it really seemed clear that your sexual harassment training is like one of your biggest pieces. And maybe that's opens doors and allows you to cross sell some of the other things. You were in the Army. Susan, you mentioned earlier that you had come from a rather male dominated organization. Obvious question. You're both women. You're designing sexual harassment training. You're selling sexual harassment training. How does your status as a female, how does that show up in that process? Does it help you? Does it hinder you? Does it open doors? Does it keep you awake at night? Talk to me a little bit as a woman in that space about what that's like.
Yeah, I think it is a great question. And I'm sure that's for Susan, like a complicated, lot of different nuances to it. I think one thing I think a lot about is the best, for example, commanders I had in the Army, they were, I would call it like ethical across the board. So I think you saw of the good commanders, they were ones who could get the best out of all of their soldiers. They were also the ones who were not playing fast and loose with other rules. They would just do the right thing, people. And that kind of extended, whether it was more of the HR right thing, whether it was more of the compliance right thing. And I think sometimes we get, whether it's like talking about DEI, harassment prevention, can it get very focused on today is the day we're going to be inclusive toward different races. Tomorrow is the day we're going to be thoughtful about different sexual orientation. And I actually think, corny as it sounds, that like really good sexual harassment training looks like really good code of conduct training, looks like really good training, which is it gets more at these like principles, do the right thing, be thoughtful and respectful. And you don't necessarily have to be like two and then insert a bunch of different groups. 2 women and also 2 this. It's just like a way of, I know it might sound like very Pollyanna-ish, but I really like I just have seen it that really thoughtful cultures like are thoughtful across the board. And it ends up being like in a really cool way. So tech, for example, ageism can be a problem in tech. And I think really good inclusion training should address that. Really good inclusion training can actually address veterans being in the workplace. I had a friend who was sharing that at his workplace, someone said something to the effect of, oh, do you have PTSD? And it was like, ooh, there are a lot of problems with that question and just not the way to start a conversation with that or really anybody. So I don't mean to dismiss like being a woman related to sexual harassment. I think there's a lot there, but I think the approach that Athena has tried to take is actually you can just get at all of these problems with a really thoughtful foundation of what are we trying to do? We're trying to be like good colleagues toward each other. even things like one of the things people call out with their harassment prevention training is you're going to screw up. So Hemma mentioned this idea of a zero tolerance culture. I think it's like one of the worst concepts out there because it makes everyone terrified. Oh my gosh, I never talked to you that before. Oh my gosh, I like don't work with a lot of women. Is it okay that I said nice blouse? And it's, you know what? It is. Okay. We can like, but also you're going to mess up. You're going to like send an email and you're going to have a ton in the army gentlemen. I was like, I'm on the email. Like, what? And so how do you teach people like not to be terrified, but instead what to do when someone makes an oops, because it is 100% going to happen. And I think that's where you can get into like really thoughtful, good, actionable training versus this like fear-based, like nobody say anything anymore. Anyway.
Right. Susan?
Yeah, I love what Roxanne just said. And I think it's absolutely true that if you focus more on the principles rather than the 5-pound rule book. I actually was reading the United Airlines magazine once, and the CEO was bragging that they had a 5-pound rule book. And I thought, that doesn't sound very good. Because if you make it totally about the rules, then people say, can I tell you that's a nice blouse or whatever? And it becomes very demerit style. So I think it's important to really focus on the principles. And one of the things I used to do when I trained at AECOM was I would be in the Middle East and I'd say, would you like your daughter treated this way? And people, no, I killed a person. Let's not do that. But let's think about why then you would tolerate unacceptable behavior in the workplace. And then the only other thing I'd say is that in my experience, no one changes their mind if you come at them and say, you screwed up, you're stupid, you don't know what you're doing. And anybody that's parented teenagers knows that too, or has learned the hard way, even though they might have had the party while you were away or whatever. So coming at it from the point of view of we're all in this together, we're all trying to work together, and we're not demonizing men or we're not demonizing another group in any way. It's how do we figure out, consistent with respect, kindness, and compassion, how we can get along. And I think that really works much better.
Thanks for
Susan,
unpacking that.
Yeah, you've nailed it. As you both were talking, all I could think of was we were all in this together, and you said those words. And that really is the crux of it. I'm hearing principle-based, human-first, empathy-driven, skills-based training. And I think that's where we get to it, where we can actually feel safe to make mistakes, feel safe to help each other, feel safe to receive that help. So very inspiring. I know, Roxanne, we talk about active bystandership a lot as well. It's one of our favorite things to bring in. And I love that you're bringing that into your training as well. So much good stuff. I hate to bring this to a close, but I'm going to just, if I may, be indulgent and ask you one last question, which is, what would be your parting guidance to our audience here when it comes to thinking about how to tackle risk management for today's employees?
I'll give a very small and actionable tip, which is I just go talk to a couple of employees, do a listening tour. I just did skip levels. Like literally every time I go talk to our team, I learned something. And I always think, oh, it's just the best use of my time or whatever. And you just like always learn a tidbit. And so I think having that really curious approach and going on a bit of just an open conversation, what's going well, what can be better, and really listening can be so powerful.
Susan?
I would second that completely. You said it perfectly.
So listening builds trust, listening for the win. I
Right.
couldn't agree more. Sarah, any last words from you?
Oh, I'm just so glad that we were able to have this conversation. And I know that our listeners will agree.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful conversation. There's lots and lots of thinking for me, at least. I can guarantee our listeners feel the same. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Great Women in Compliance.
And